Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Edge seminar series for 2021 for Hark and Silk. We are incredibly lucky today to welcome Professor Hugh Cheape as our speaker. Professor Hugh Cheape devised and teaches through the medium of Gaelic with Dr. Don William Stewart, a postgraduate programme, which is Material Culture and the Gaeltacht History at Ostaig, the National Centre for Gaelic Language and Culture, UHI. The MSc has grown out of his curatorial and ethnological work during a career in the National Museums of Scotland, where latterly he was principal curator in the Department of Scotland and Europe. He's published widely in the subject fields of ethnology and musicology, including studies in Scottish agricultural history, vernacular architecture, piping, tartans, dye analysis, pottery, charms and amulets, and talismanic belief. His books include Periods in Highland History with I.F. Grant, Tartan, The Highland Habit, Witness to Rebellion with Ian Gordon Brown, The Book of the Bagpipes, a national collection of a national instrument, and he has edited Tools and Traditions, Studies in European Ethnology presented to Alexander Fenton, and A Very Civil People, Hebridean Folk History and Tradition, essays by John Lorne Campbell. In 1992, he was asked to support John Lorne Campbell and Margaret Fay Shaw in the work of organising their papers for safekeeping, and latterly was appointed John Lorne Campbell's executor and literary executor. This was when he first learnt about the Sea League. So he's speaking today on the literature of Highland protest, the Sea League and its newsletter 1933 to 1939. And before we hand over to Hugh, may I just say that if you have any questions, could you post them into the chat line for the Q&A session at the end of his talk. Thank you so much. Very welcome, Hugh.
Many thanks, Lindsay. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me okay? Grand, thank you. Well, thank you, Lindsay. And before I begin, I must thank Fiona Mackenzie, the archivist of the Campbell of Canna collections in Canna House, and somebody who has been consistently helpful to me in developing this subject, or trying to develop this subject. And I'm deeply grateful to Fiona for all that she does very willingly when she has her own cares to look after in the needs of the National Trust for Scotland. And I must start in a way with a disclaimer by just saying this is really a work in progress. I've known about the Sea League papers since 1992 to 1996 when I was working with John Lorne Campbell, but I never really had the time to develop my interest in them. But I really now feel that they are a series of papers that are of enormous potential and interest for contemporary affairs and also for research in the University of the Highlands and Islands. So whatever shortcomings there are in my account, and there are many, I offer this just as an entree and an insight into a topic that I think has enormous resonance. So for me, this is truly a tale from the edge. It tells us about the gulf between the so-called edge and the so-called centre. And it really tells us about perceptions of the neglect of a remote government and the delays caused by bureaucracy, both modern and old-fashioned. And what we have is a remarkable local view of events in the 1930s And I would say, just to be aware, that this local view is instigated by an elite, and that should be a thought that we should keep in the fronts of our minds, but at the same time lapping up what the Sea League has to tell us. So it's about politics at the local level, and it's about conservation. So both of these are, I would say, very modern causes. Politics, let's say the ephemeral; conservation, the environment, the perpetual. And I think this is some of the most striking sides of the Sea League papers, that we see sense so strongly this idea of the sea and the oceans, the perpetual surge of the oceans, and haftarach art, and our profligacy in how we deal with the richest fishing areas of the world. These areas of modest ocean depth, a nearby continental shelf, and the Atlantic currents meeting the Baltic cold water currents, and everything that arises from these natural phenomena. And I'll just go to... So the top of my talk, so to speak, the top surface, the pelagic element in my talk is the Sea League itself and its newsletter. And you see here just a summary from an image of the newsletter itself, and you can then see what sort of source we're dealing with. A delightful source in so many ways, I must say. But the Sea League, you see the summary here in the slide, founded in July 1933, Comunn Iasgairean namara, very strong Gaelic blas or tinge to it, were there to lobby for the closing of the Minch to trawlers, for the increase of fines for illegal fishing, and to rebuild local inshore fishing on nets and long lines. And this little summary of the paper itself: a bilingual newsletter between September 1936 and March 1939. I think about 12 numbers. This leads me just to mention that, not being able to visit Canna during the pandemic, I did a lot of library searching for copies of the Sea League and ended up in the Radcliffe Library in Oxford to find that they had copies of the Sea League. National Library of Scotland has copies, Edinburgh University has copies, but nobody appeared to have a complete set. And so I do trust that we have a complete set in Canna House. And I look forward to getting a complete look at the whole lot, because as a part of my disclaimer, I haven't read every word in the Sea Leaguer, the newspaper. And the editing and writing of the Sea Leaguer newspaper was largely the work of John Lon Campbell. And it does form a series of radical documents which should be better known as largely forgotten material from what John Lon Campbell himself suggested, and I think rather well, the literature of Highland protest. And of course, throughout the numbers of the Sea Leaguer newspaper, it throws a powerful contemporary light on the trajectory of declining fish stocks in what had been some of the most prolific fishing grounds in the world. And of course, this is a deeply, deeply serious and contemporary issue that was being opened up from the 1930s. And I suppose, as we'll see later on, was temporarily buried by the outbreak of the Second World War. Well, in my talk, having introduced you to the Sea Leaguer, the newspaper of the Sea League, I'm going to have a look at the bigger picture of fisheries, and as it were, looking at the issue from textbook to shoreline. As I thought to myself, Clatoch na Nélan, we go right down to local level, And we have a brief look at the material culture of fishing, the founding of the Sea League itself, its program, and its campaign, and how it pursued its different purposes, looking at later politics, and then considering to what extent this can be viewed as a thoroughly modern cause. So I would suggest that the broad issues of the Hebridean fishery are pretty well known from the textbooks and the studies that have been done. And what we read about is the success of the Dutch fishery industry from almost the 15th, 16th, and particularly 17th and 18th centuries. And that's usually stated just as an issue, which is kind of an excuse that Scotland was unable to compete or failed to compete and so on. But I think it's interesting that we learnt a lot from the Dutch, which had allowed the development of a native British-Scottish fishing industry. We do know that Dutch fishing was carried out close to and on the coast of Scotland, and this probably put a stop to fishing locally, or at least the development of an effective fishing fleet at a local level. And of course, what was happening was that the Dutch buses, these bigger 60-ton vessels, would buy from all the inshore fishermen. So perhaps there was little incentive really to do anything else but sell to the big ships that were working the coast. And then in the later 17th and the 18th centuries, we have the Dutch, French and English boats vying for control of Hebridean fisheries and catching in these waters. And the local account stresses that what was happening in the Hebrides themselves was lack of boats and gear and capital really worked against any chance of Hebrideans establishing a controlling interest in their own sea fisheries. So from a Hebridean point of view, Shalweg Farsing, Erin Iasgairean, a wider look on the fishing. The most important thing is that the issue really for us is that public and political interest growing through the 18th century in improvement as a political strategy and as a philosophical aim for social development was part and parcel of the Enlightenment. And this bounced down to the fishing industry in the form of the, first of all, the bounty system to try and encourage the fishing industry as a whole. On the whole, the bounty system was not widely successful, although it continued for some time. Commercial fishing was handicapped by the salt laws, with high rates of duty levied on imported salts, but the belief grew that improvement could transform the economy of the Highlands. And the outcome of that was this initiative, the founding of the British Fisheries Society in July 1786 by the Highland Society of London to establish so-called fishing stations on the north and west coasts. And that was of limited success, really. And it's said that it has been said by analysts such as Malcolm Gray that it wasn't successful because it was largely a capital venture in the hands of, if you like, a capitalist class, the landowners and leading merchants. And so that the locals might have made some money from their own catches and so forth, but they were effectively wage earners of those who ran the fishing stations, the landowners and the merchants. So nothing developed very strongly for people at a local level. And in fact, the main centres that the British Fisheries Society founded on the west, Ullapool, Loch Bay in Staffin, and other places. Well, Wick was very successful, but the other places were never really successful. It did bring cultural change, which I think is neatly detectable in Gaelic song and verse, and from a Gaelic point of view, and that's a concept that could be explored a bit further. We have the onshore dimension of the curing houses and salt stores. They became an established part of West Coast history, along with the centres of commercial activity or fishing villages. But of course, these also received the victims of the clearances. So, taking it onto the ground, we have this very important comment from James MacDonald in his General View of the Agriculture of the Hebrides, 1811, so that's quite an early statement. The important thing for us is that James MacDonald came from North Ùisdean and knew what he was talking about, and he gave, if you like, a very unfashionable opinion to his Enlightenment audience, saying the great body of seafaring Hebrideans are now metamorphosed into slavish kelpers. So that was the first issue, and the next, of course, was the onset of sheep farming. I particularly like this image, which is from William Daniel's tour of the coasts of Britain, because unlike 19th century artists whose landscapes, very dominating landscapes, tend to be utterly deserted, our artist here showed a very busy landscape and a very active landscape, and of course artist license, but I believe that he was inspired to fill his landscapes with people, and of course here we see people fishing, and I would suggest that the giveaway sign that they were busy fishing is the number of birds flocking around them. Also, of course, we have this great pall of smoke from the shore showing kelp burning going on, so it shares rather nicely. This image is a rather beautiful symbol of everything that was going or going wrong in the Hebrides in the 1820s. So, rushing forward to the end of the 19th century and the next generation or so, this is the reality of fishing at the local level. Most Hebrideans lived by the sea, but not on the sea. In other words, they did not really gain a proper living from the sea. What they were getting was additional fresh food to the family. They were crofters with boats. And both of my pictures here, I think, symbolize that. The one on the left, a rather well-known picture from Loch Duich in the 1880s or 1890s, showing a little township, a cluster of houses, and a boat in front of them. And obviously an inshore fishing boat, you can tell from the type of boat it is. And then forward a generation and a half to the 1930s, we have a nice picture of a croft in, let me see, I think it must be Barra. And these are the one of the pictures by Margaret Fay Shaw. And I should say, as a thanks again, that most of my pictures I'm showing are by courtesy of the National Trust for Scotland and from the camera of the gifted and original Margaret Fay Shaw. So here we see a modern croft house, if you like, probably a Board of Agriculture house, the sort of house that's known in Gaelic as Taia Wurst, and a white house, if you like, Taigyal, but more significantly, a little gyo in front of it with two boats, one a little dinghy and a scaw, or a boat capable of going further afield with long lines. And just as a final reminder of sustenance and subsistence, this is a wonderful picture by Margaret Fay Shaw of a man, Roderick McCormick, I think his name was, at his house in Lochainort, that's on the east coast of South Ùisdean. And what catches the eye is the great rank of probably cuddies, saiths, whitefish, drying, split and drying on the fence in front of his house. So here's a man who has got a good catch, and you can infer from a picture like this, how has he caught these fish? Has he been out in a boat? Well, at his age, maybe not. Has he got this from his neighbours? Maybe, maybe not. But there are other issues in catching fish locally, and this is just a look in at the material culture of shore fishing when there's a look at this, the dorog hand line for fishing, and in Dwelly of all the different parts of it. This is some of the value, the glory of Edward Dwelly's dictionary, this hero from Surrey who produced the very, very weighty dictionary of Scottish Gaelic in 1901 to 1911, and produced illustrations. And so in many of his illustrations, he has a detailed terminology, which we have here. The other fishing method which sprung to mind, but which I hadn't immediately got a picture of, is the tav, or the big fishing net, which was used for fishing off the rocks. And I think Mr. McCormick's family have been fishing with the tav, or big bag net as it was called, where you have this huge net, possibly 2 to 3 foot across, and it's on the end of a long shaft, and you sink it below the surface of the sea, and you scatter the bait on top of the water, sink the net, and the cuddies swim in and grab the bait, and you then gradually lift the net, and you've got a net full of fish. And I guess that somebody has been fishing with the tav or bag net to get Mr. McCormick's winter supply of food. And of course, baiting lines, I've mentioned the dorog, the hand line, and the tav, the big bag net. And otherwise, the most significant fishing method at this time was small lines, hand lines, possibly about anything from 20 to 50 fathoms long, with hundreds of baited hooks on them, for which the baiting work was long and tedious. But here we've got on the right a boat's crew of 4 men baiting the lines and putting the hooks into the scull or skull, which they carried the lines in and into the boat. And the lyrical picture on the left, taken by Margaret Fayshaw, of digging for lugworm on the strand overlooking the Sound of Barra in South Ùisdean, a lyrical picture, no doubt fantastic on a summer's day, as we can see here, but not always so, and very often conducted in a mood of some desperation, or certainly historically was. Now this moves us on to the Sea League itself, and this picture is really what I call the Dramatis Personae of the Sea League. This highly significant picture taken on John Lorne Campbell's motor yacht, built in Govan in 1934, 1935, and named the Gillibrige, was used by him, of course, for his life in the islands. And here he has a gang of his pals, and as I say, these are, if you like, the founding brains of the Sea League. For example, at the back of the boat, you've got, let's see if I can pick up the cursor, Compton Mackenzie here, for whom much will be said in a short while. John Lorne Campbell here, and going left to right, this is Neil Sinclair, a local Barra man who'd been a great help to John Lorne Campbell in perfecting his Gaelic. A neighbour of next to him, Mr. MacLeod of Ùisdean, with whom Compton Mackenzie had lodgings. This is Compton Mackenzie's secretary, whom he later married. This is Seamus McKinnon, a local Barra man and a great tradition bearer. Compton Mackenzie, John Lorne Campbell. This is John Macpherson, county councillor and general mover and shaker known as the Coddy, and this is Mr. MacLeod, Ardvinish's son. As I say, these are the Dramatis Personae. By this time, Compton Mackenzie, who had initially invited John Long Campbell to come to Canna, well, he himself was well settled there, I mean Compton Mackenzie, and was in a sense in exile in Barra, having to flee the anger of politicians and journalists in London because he had written scathingly about national affairs. And in having arrived in Barra in, I think about 1931 or 1930, he, by this time, he had really settled there properly to the point that he built this house on the Macher in the north end of Barra. So here you have a very vivid story of somebody coming to settle in the islands and being something of a mover and shaker, if you like, a kind of intellectual leader, whatever anyone else thought about that. And he, as I say, built his own house. Now, in terms of the Sea League itself, I believe that this is where it was cooked up. This was the pool room or billiard room in Compton Mackenzie's new house on the Barra Macher. This was where political discussion was had and where the ideas of the Sea League, really discussion of the utter destruction going on around the shores of the islands, and the constant reiterated comment from everyone in Barra and the other islands about the destruction of fishing, the inshore fishing, particularly the destruction done by trawlers who had been coming in from really the 1880s with the improvement of boat types taking place on the east coast of Scotland. And then the advent of steam trawlers was somehow the final nail in the coffin. So the idea of a campaign against trawling and against the violation of fishing limits, because it was well known in the islands that the 3-mile fishing limit was constantly violated by the trawlers. And of course, as they worked in the shallow waters within the 3-mile limit, and when you talk about shallow waters in parts of the Hebrides, these are very, very shallow waters indeed, as you see from some of the areas around Barra. And in fact, exactly in front of Compton Mackenzie's house, you have the Thrive Oar, this huge open expanse of beach, which is, of course, quite a large proportion of the 3-mile limit. And I can't remember if it's counted from high tide or low tide watermark or a medium point. Never mind. The fact is uncontestable that the trawlers were damaging the fishing and had damaged the fishing. So this was where the campaign was drawn up, and it goes from, as it were, the pool room in Compton Mackenzie's house to the church hall in Castle Bay on the 22nd of July 1933. Significantly, a local priest in the chair, Reverend Father Dominic McKellig of Craigston, and Mr. Mackenzie, Ardvinish. I notice with amusement how he's developed a local persona, delivered an address on the objects of the Sea League, which were the closing of the Minch and the Murray Firth to trawlers, foreign as well as British. So you see, the programme that the Sea League were developing was to close the Minch. And we'll return to that point because it has bigger significance. Protection of these seas alike with the waters within the 3-mile limit round the Scottish coasts by an effective system of fishery cruisers. And again, that's another point that we'll return to in the campaigning. And Object 3, the enrolment of fishermen and others interested in the fishing industry in the Sea League to act in concert in securing Objects 1 and 2 above. The minutes of the meeting go on to declare that the Mr. Compton Mackenzie moved a sea league be formed to protect the interests of Scottish fishermen. And this man, John Macpherson, the Coddy, North Bay, seconded, and the motion was carried by the unanimous vote of the audience. Now, just to reiterate my disclaimer, I haven't been able to, in detail, analyse who that audience was, but I've seen the list of attendees, and they seem to be all local men, I should say. There seem to be no women in there. All local men and with different interests in the fisheries. In other words, merchants as well as active fishermen. So this is another thing to get round to, in other words, to get some sense of the membership of the Sea League and the numbers in it and their sort of social and economic status. So the Sea League goes ahead rapidly. A lot of enthusiasm to start off, and as I say, with the unanimous support of the inaugural meeting, a billet, a bilac, a little leaflet was produced, and it's a bilingual leaflet, and it makes very good reading, of course, both in English and in Gaelic. And I notice it's printed in the Gazette office in Stornoway, so they're working probably closely with the newspapers, and that is evident from the way that the Stornoway Gazette was picking up on these issues, which, again, in parenthesis, I have not yet scanned the papers of the Stornoway Gazette to get a view of this. But anyway, so on the left-hand page of the leaflet, we have what the Sea League stands for, and I think it's a very good mission statement. The Sea League has been formed to demand the same protection for the livelihood of the crofter fishermen as is given to the sporting fishing of the landowners themselves. Nice political swipe at prevailing politics in a way, which of course we remember that perhaps in the 20s and 30s, in spite of the rise of the Labour Party and the Labour governments of Ramsay MacDonald, it was, if you like, the rather old-fashioned conservative interests of the landed classes which still ruled. So that's a splendid swipe at that. And the objects of the Sea League are that the Minch, between a line from Barra Head to Tiree and a line from the Butt of Lewis to Cape Wrath, shall be closed to trawlers, and that the fishing in this area shall be regulated to the benefit of the fishermen who live around it. A thoroughly democratic cause. 2, that the penalties for illegal trawling shall be increased and the policing of the inshore waters made more efficient. Now, this takes into account that there were already fines, penalties for illegal trawling, but the complaint was that the fishery cruisers were never efficient in catching the trawlermen, and it led to a point constantly made in the Sea Leaguer that the fishery trawlers were servants of the fishery board as a national government appointed body, and the fishery board was under the influence of the British trawlermen's, the British trawler fishing interests, which of course in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century were powerful and represented a very highly capitalized part of British industries. And of course, Barra was not Lowestoft and Great Yarmouth and Hull and Grimsby and so on. So that is what the complaint was about. So point 3, that the fines inflicted for illegal trawling shall be used for financing fishermen who have lost their gear through illegal trawling or who want to commence inshore fishing for the first time. And that, I think, throws a very fair light on what had been happening in that generation. We're talking about the early 30s and the generations before that. And I will, in a few minutes, read an interesting case from Lewis from the 1890s about illegal trawling and what happened. So the Sea League intends to fight unceasingly for these objects. Join the Sea League. Subscription 1 shilling. And write in Gaelic or English, Gaelic first, note, to the Secretary, North Bay, Barra. And of course, as I said, The secretary was John Lord Campbell. Yes, I failed to mention that John Lord Campbell, having gone to Barra in 1933, stayed there until 1938. So he was a constant fixture in Barra at the time and learnt very endable Barra. So this sense of a fraternity and of a cause was stiffened, we hope, by the provision of these lovely badges. And thank you, Fiona, for these pictures of the badges of the Sea League, of which there's still a goodly collection in the Canna collections. And you can see they're not any cheapo piece of stamped tin. These are brass-backed, enameled, nicely designed, bilingual, very superior little items, and I hope were worn with pride. I've never seen anyone wearing one, by the way, but I wish I had, or I might still do. So the most important point which set the programme of the Sea League going was the understanding, the realisation that the terms of the Sea Fisheries Regulation Scotland Act of 1895, that's an Act of Parliament, so a statute, had never been taken up. The Act provided for the founding, creation of sea fishery districts and sea fishing district committees to regulate sea fisheries within those districts, powers conferred by the Secretary of State of Scotland to County Council to elect members and to pass bylaws for the regulation of local fisheries. And the Act also provided for the creation of a 13-mile fishery limit in Scottish waters. Now, it seems to me extraordinary, and I hope to all of us, extraordinary that the Sea Fisheries Regulation Scotland Act 1895 had languished on a shelf in Westminster or wherever. And this was one of the first and bitter points made by the Sea League, that the terms of the Sea Fisheries Regulation Scotland Act 1895 had never been carried out. And it had, if you see, you can see sea fisheries committees existed in England and Wales. The same regulations, the same statutes applied to England and Wales had been uplifted and were working. And from the comments in the Sea Leaguer, because the newspaper gets people writing from other fishery district committees in England and Wales, and obviously it works, or to an extent it worked, at least it was the first major step. And then we have this very telling remark from Compton Mackenzie, writing in 1955. Failure to carry out the provisions of the 1895 Act has been the main cause for the complete ruin of West Highland fishermen. So the early campaign of the Sea League was against illegal trawling. And we see this, a very long letter in the Scotsman, 28th of December 1933, page 11 by John Lord Campbell. I have to thank my colleague, Professor Norman MacDonald in Portree for the copy of this letter. And he is unequivocal about what is happening. And in this letter, he raises the issue of the interests of the trawler men, the trawler industry, being uppermost in the minds of politicians and the political parties, and how this should be countered and could be countered if the terms of the Sea Fisheries Regulation Scotland Act 1895 were implemented. At this time too, there was a bill going through Parliament, a bill sponsored by the, I have to say, the Conservative politicians in the national government. That's Ramsay MacDonald's second government. And of course, the bill gets a mention in the King's speech, and this little billet is sent by the Sea League, this is a nice one, to the powers that be, dated Barra, the Outer Hebrides, December 1933, of course, just the early days of the Sea League, where the writer, I presume John Long Campbell and Compton Mackenzie, complain about the issue of illegal trawling and the fact that the bill is about the raising of fines for illegal trawling. In other words, accepting that illegal trawling was a matter of fact and that everybody did it. But a gesture should be made and the fine should be raised. Well, the bill went through Parliament as the Illegal Trawling Act, believe it or not, passed in the government in 1934, the following year, and increasing the maximum penalty for illegal trawling from £100 to £200. And one might say that was pretty feeble. Well, 1934-35, the Sea Leaguer itself takes off in, as I said at the beginning, in March 1935, and September 1936 is the first number, and the campaign is carried on in the pages of the Sea Leaguer. And you can see, as I pointed out before, the style of the document. What I would like to know still is how many were produced. This was done on a typewriter by John Long Campbell. I recognise the typeface, at least I reckon I do. And how many numbers were produced? What was the circulation list? How many were sent out? And I think there was probably a fair number left, because when I first got to know John Long Campbell in the early 1990s, he was very generous giver of articles and off-prints and so forth. And among the things he gave me was 2 copies of the Sea Leaguer, which I treasure and have long treasured and wondered at them, and at last, in a way, have begun to dig and look at them more closely. So the Sea Leaguer progressed through about 12 numbers altogether. I think 12 numbers. There are 2 of them I haven't yet seen, but the campaign was continued and accelerated from time to time. The progress of the Sea League was reported on, both its triumphs and its failures, and failures in terms of the deaf ears turned on the Sea League voices, as it were, by the authorities, whether it's central government or local government, and the disappointment of people in the Hebrides, in the islands, in Barra, in South Ùisdean and so forth, at the failure for their message to get through, the message about illegal trawling, first of all, the violating of the 3-mile limit, the exasperation over the sea fisheries regulations 1895, and the rhetorical question about why this hasn't been taken up and applied, the issue of fishery districts, and the fact that the Sea League had formulated a petition for the creation of a fishery district based on the Inverness County Council area of the Outer Isles. That is Benbecula, the Ùisdean, South Ùisdean, Barra, and so forth. So the Southern Isles, the Outer Hebrides. And this petition had been put forward with a huge number of local signatures on it. It's an impressive piece, only to sit unanswered, really, with the County Council. And at the end, we'll just maybe consider that point of why these things were neglected. Yes, the other issues were enforcement of the limits, discussion of contemporary politics in a very unrestrained way, which makes for very interesting reading. And although we are getting the, as it were, the arguments posed by an elite, I do think that Compton Mackenzie and John Long Campbell had their ears pinned back and used every bit of local information and opinion that they could. And in fact, there's 1 or 2 very good statements by local people, such as Neil Sinclair, and Scholar Ruag from Barra, from Castlebay, and one of the fishery, the Sea League subcommittee spokesman, somebody Alistair Steele from South Uist, well-known name in South Uist. So there is a lot of local value in these views. They go on to complain about the state of public expenditure, especially the roads, and a little more on this in a minute, and telecommunications. Why are they so bad? Why is no money spent on this? Constructive proposals for island fisheries, and most important, certainly for me at Solmor Ostaig, I mentioned that this is a bilingual newsletter, and there is a so-called Gaelic page, and it's not like the fun section of the Sunday Post, not just entertainment. This is a serious issue, because at the same time as he was engaged in this political issue, John Lon Campbell had embarked on the serious recording of Gaelic traditions in the Outer Isles. Serious to the point that he acquired the machinery to do it, and was the first recorder using mechanical means to record spoken Gaelic and sung Gaelic in the Outer Isles. And that's a whole other issue, which Toparondolhish is our immediate source of information, and which I, of course, recommend you to go to. But the Gaelic page is very, very moving, and there's a lot come from Margaret Fay Shaw's neighbour in North Glendale, South Uist, that's Shonny Campbell, one of the crofters in North Glendale, South Loch Ùisdean, and some stories from him, which really, they're restrained, but they are enormously moving. There's a very interesting story about how, now these two men on the right hand are Shonny Campbell's sons, and so Shonny Campbell gives a story of how obviously he was out in this very boat, and they got caught in the storm when lifting lobster creels, and how they rode out that storm. And although it was told in a very fluent and fluid way, you kind of feel the pain behind it. It really, they had to ride out a night in the most appalling conditions, wet through, and they did survive, I'm glad to say. And there's another amazing story, La Ahonigmi Asayach Adol For, the day I saw the big ship go down. And it's a sort of ghost story, and it really is very, very interesting. Well, the Sea Leaguer, as I say, continues through 12 numbers to 1939, and really kind of fails with the outbreak of the Second World War. Well, one of the extraordinary side issues, which is part of the Sea League activity, and I won't dwell on this because it's nothing to do with fisheries, but of course it is to do with government neglect, the mannerly deafness of local authorities to what was happening. But the story of the Barra car strike and the Lochmaddy Sheriff Court case was told in the pages of the Sea Leaguer. And a group of people with cars and lorries in Barra refused to pay their road tax and were prosecuted, and this was the case. And it makes for interesting reading. And it, of course, is part of the political discourse at the time, or at least it's created as part of the political discourse. The cartoon in the Stornoway Gazette shows the Secretary of State for Scotland, Mr. Walter Elliott, arriving in Barra and being taken around to see for himself what was happening. But of course, the spokespeople for the Sea League, and I thinly disguised Compton Mackenzie here in the background, as he was usually kilted, the fact was, what they were railing against was that the Secretary of State for Scotland never met anyone locally and never spoke to anyone. He came on the fishery cruiser Minna. No, he flew by air and was taken around on the fishery cruiser Minna. So to see things as they are, as was quoted from him, but he didn't really experience any of the real things, and he never spoke to anyone. And this is a trenchant opinion from, I guess, the Secretary of the Sea League. Barra has more than one experience. he wrote sternly, of visiting politicians who travel in comfort and carefully avoid consulting genuine local opinion on questions of pressing importance. These methods do not inspire confidence in the present leaders of the country. So my time is running on, and I must draw to a close. The Sea League's program, as you can imagine, becomes more pointed and is sharpened in many ways. So this is one of the later statements about their aims, and one again about illegal trawling, of course, and then the important point that I'll just skate over here, but that John Lone Campbell has spent a huge amount of time studying fishery policies and politics in other countries, particularly Norway. And he found that the protection of their fisheries, and the same in Iceland and the Faroes, is a lesson that all could learn from. And beautifully, there is a Nova Scotian bumper number in 1937, 12 pages long, and it's all about adult education in the Maritimes in Canada, again drawing the point that this movement has clear lessons for the Highlands and Islands, which of course was reiterated by John Lone Campbell. Now, in the outbreak of the Second World War, just before that, John Lone Campbell and Sir Alexander MacEwan, a nationalist politician, he had stood for in the 1933 general election for the Scottish National Party, or was it the National Party of Scotland, and hadn't got a seat but had won, but had effectively split the Liberal vote. He was very sympathetic to the Sea League and supported John Lone Campbell in a booklet called Act Now for the Highlands and Islands, 1939, which sketches out exactly what has happened really from the 1960s onwards in terms of politics, devolution, the exercise of local powers, the encouragement of local industries, and conservation issues, all been recommended by the members of the Sea League in the 1930s. But Act Now for the Highlands and Islands is buried by the Second World War. John Lone Campbell continues writing, and he has two very thoughtful essays in the Gaelic periodical Ùisdean in the 1950s, one on the Cod War, and where he discusses what Iceland was doing. And of course, he, possibly behind the cover of Gaelic, he's able to say that, well, the Icelanders are quite right, in spite of the tub thumping, the drum beating among British journalists. So the second bullet point here is a quote from the article. There's another perspective, and the Gaels know about that. They remember their shores, the shores of the outer isles, Skye and the mainland, alive with fish, until that shameful work of the trawlers came close to the shore over 60 years ago, and perhaps more. And the last cryptic quote is of a fishery cruiser skipper who says, "I wouldn't get thanks for it. I was made to understand that it wouldn't do me any good to be too diligent in catching them." That's the trawlers. You'll understand the business. The trawler folks were pretty strong in the fishery board itself, which was the conspiracy I'd referred to. So, get Comunn Iasgairean, a last word on the Sea League. And it's a rather lovely point, quote by John Lone Campbell. "Personally, I've never been more thoroughly convinced of the justice of any cause than I was of the Sea League. The situation was a revelation of the attitude of the Westminster government and the Scottish office towards the Hebrides. The islands were despised because they were poor, and they were poor because their economic interests in the greatest source of wealth accessible to them, the sea, had been sacrificed to those of the English trawler monopolies." Now, I think that is a trenchant view, and I would say it's pretty fair. And just note, he publishes this in the Scots Magazine because he had a strong belief that the Scots Magazine was a very useful journal and should be patronized by serious writers. So it's a thoroughly modern cause from the point of view that we, in the post-Brexit days, we're on about the same things: the destruction of local industry and the unrestricted access to British waters, and the fact that European countries want to fish in British waters and have got away with hundreds of thousands of tons of fish and shellfish annually. And it seems that something should be done about this. Now, I personally was not a party to this debate, but everything I would say that was being trumpeted by the Sea League was also has also been in a way mentioned in some way or another by the Brexit negotiators. And I had hoped to finish with a rousing song, Barracks Strike, the lads of the fishing, and we had a great struggle with the sound files and the web and so forth. And I'm sorry to say I couldn't get it onto my system, but Joe has very kindly put a link to it on the chat show, the chat space, and so I hope you'll all listen to it, because it's a wonderful song. In this case, it's sung by a Ùisdean, Norrie McKeever, so it has a good Lewis edge to it, because it was composed by Donald Morrison in the 1930s. So it speaks from the time. Now, it's a very rousing song, but there is a backstory to it which shows that you couldn't really make a proper living from the sea, and it was too hard because of trawler interest, and that in fact there's a giveaway line in it that the singer admits that he goes off to the East Coast to get employment on East Coast boats. So that's really the final word from Lewis. Now, just to consider one or two points, or at least perhaps I should finish there, because what I do think is important is that we can perhaps understand more about the Sea League if we consider the politics, the interwar politics of Scotland and Britain. And I think there's a lot to say for taking the subject forward to interpret it a little more within national politics and national economics of the Great Depression. And also, I believe, as a separate programme for Gaelic as against the Scottish Renaissance that was being masterminded and under the wizardly guidance of Hugh McDermott, that there was an alternative anti-Caillard movement in the Gaelic world, which had a political programme and a very strong political programme as dictated, as put out by the Sea League. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that others would be encouraged to take forward this subject in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugh. That was just absolutely fascinating, and such a rich talk about relevant to contemporary affairs, politics, local powers, destruction of local industries. Absolutely fascinating. We are a little bit pushed for time, so I'm going to just read Ian Robertson's question. He says that the last events of the land wars had yet to play out in July 1933, and as part of the literature of the Highlands and Islands protest, Hugh, do you see any substantial connections between the Sea League and the disturbances on land, which of course included fishermen too?
Sorry, I didn't quite get, I'm just trying to pick up Ian's question in the chat. Is it early on in the chat, or?
It's a little bit earlier on, yes. Would you like me to repeat it?
Yeah, I couldn't quite hear that.
Okay.
At the end.
The question is, the last events of the land wars had yet to play out in July of 1933. So as part of the literature of Highlands and Islands protest, Hugh, do you see any substantial connections between the Sea League and disturbances on land, but which of course included the fishermen too?
Oh, well, yes, very, very much so. I would have mentioned if I had been on the platform for too much longer, the very, I think, self-conscious adoption of the spirit of the Highland Land League and the example of the Highland Land League as a political agent and a political body, and the fact that John Lon Campbell and I presume Compton Mackenzie, and I have to admit I haven't yet delved into Compton Mackenzie's autobiography, but I must. But I believe there is a very strong and conscious link with other literature of protest. Now, whether the Sea League itself feeds into later protests, I'm not yet sure.
Thank you, Hugh. That's lovely. I'll just quickly mention two other questions. One also was, somebody is saying, I spent some time in the Cornish Sea Fisheries Committee. The papers held in Truro. And in the first half of the 20th century, much time was spent blaming others for declining catches. Dolphins, porpoises, shags, cormorants, puffins, gannets. And before the 1930s, the real criminals were identified. The grey seal menace. Did the Sea League ever blame non-humans for?
Now, I see this question, Robert. Thank you very much for this, and that's a very serious and real point. I haven't yet found any complaints about non-humans, any other species preying on the fish and so forth. I have to say, it's because I think, to be fair, for them in the Sea League and their very serious campaign to get this dormant Act of Parliament up and running, they had to just this time ignore what other predators there were.
Thank you, Hugh. There's one quick question I think we'll go to from Jill de Fresnay, who is
Jill, yes. Where's that?
Who is asking about the ring net fishing methods and the worry that people had about the number of herring caught. She says, of course, the Highland fishermen became involved in that fishery too, but I also wonder how many local fishermen were members of the Sea League. Was this also showing a West Coast, East Coast split in fishing cultures? The Scottish fishing communities did work together too over the years, with the women involved in the gutting as well, though some crofting communities would have more girls going to the gutting than others. I wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
That's great. Yeah, I can see that. Jill, thank you very much, and good to hear from you. We must have a cup of coffee sometime when times ease up a bit. The ring net issue is a huge one, in fact, from the point of view of the Sea League, because of the destruction it was doing to the herring, and of course the resulting discarding and dumping that might take place. So yes, ring net fishing is a great destruction. And there's one of the Sea League newspapers has a really fascinating essay from Mr. K.M. Macmillan, I think, writing from Lewis. That might be the Labour MP to be, I'm not quite sure. In other words, Donald Stewart's predecessor and long-term Labour Member of Parliament for the Outer Isles. It might be him, but it's a very, very good letter to the Secretary of State complaining about the utter destruction done by ring netting. And that's certainly a constant echoing point in the Sea League newspaper itself in the 30s.
Excellent. Thank you, Hugh. I can only thank you again. We are 7 minutes over time. And so I think we had better close our session today. And before people go, may I there's so many very, very big thanks for you, Hugh, in the chat. So many people have really, really enjoyed it. And Jo is giving us further information there to look at. Just in terms of housekeeping, may I just highlight that on the Edge web pages, you will be able to see information about the Hark and Silk upcoming conference on the 15th and 16th of December. The programme details will open up in autumn. It will be a blended conference and online for all attendees. So please check that out. And thank you everyone for coming today, and most especially thank you, Hugh, for a fantastic talk. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.